Hello and welcome to the Squatting Puffin, and today we'll talk about the lamest federal holiday of them all. I was working on a script about socialist millionaires, and it's probably going to be super old news by the time it comes out, but then I remembered that it's Labor Day, and you know what that means. It's time to celebrate women in labor or something. Hold on a second. Let me check my notes. Labor unions. Why do we have a day off to celebrate? Alright, so government holidays usually are things like Martin Luther King Jr.'s birthday or Washington's birthday to remember great men who shaped the country. Or they celebrate major moments that brought us together, such as Patriots' Day, better known as September 11th, Armistice Day, better known as Veterans Day, and Independence Day, better known as the 4th of July. We also do things like Memorial Day, where we celebrate those who have given their lives for our freedoms. But, Puffin, what about Christmas? And then there's Labor Day, the celebration of labor unions. Labor Day was signed into law as a national holiday by President Grover Cleveland in 1894 to appease the labor unions, while he was actively intervening against the railroad labor unions in the Pullman strikes of also 1894 because he didn't want the railroad construction delayed. Side note, the appeasement didn't work, he lost the support of the unions, and the Democrat president was voted out after his first term. But, Puffin, Labor Day didn't start in 1894. People celebrated it before then. But even though it was signed into law as a federal holiday in June of 1894, it was already a state holiday in 30 states before then. The first state was Oregon, clear back in 1887, 7 years earlier. But what are we even celebrating on Labor Day? Obviously, labor. Jeez. In 1793, the Industrial Revolution had finally arrived in the United States, about 3 years after the rest of the West, because we were young and far away. And suddenly, cities went from places where markets happened and docks were built to places where mass manufacturing happened. There were now lots of jobs to be had in the cities, and where there are jobs, people in need of jobs will follow. However, many of these jobs were quite perilous, as the machinery was new and not particularly safe. I mean, safety wasn't even a thing that was considered when the steam engine was first conceived of. Many workers were maimed and killed by the early machines as leather belts powered by steam turbines would whip around just above people's heads, and open gears and pistons would pump right beside where workers' hands needed to be working, and boilers would be poorly attended by people who didn't even know what the word pressure meant. We also have the disgusting conditions that plagued cities before things like indoor plumbing became common. Black smoke coal burning stopped happening in factories just downtown, and defecating horses ceased to be the primary users of city streets. And all that brought disease and plague that was uncommon in the rural areas. Speaking of horses, there was even a fear at one point before the car was invented that if the cities kept growing at the rate they were, it would be impossible to remove all the horse poop from the streets of New York fast enough, and travel through the city would cease. Literally a horse poop apocalypse that was stopped by the car. And there was also the fact that with work moving to solitary stations in front of a machine instead of being acres of open field, you could now light a worker's station with an oil lamp and have them toil far more hours of the night, for far more of the year than you would get from typical agricultural labor. Of course, there was also the wages issue. People were moving to locations where all the food and goods had to be shipped in from miles away, and there was limited land, which is why we build up instead of out in most cities, so the cost of living was very high. But they were performing work that often required no special set of skills. Where on earth would you go to get trained to use a machine that was invented yesterday and had no conceivable predecessor? Or only required minimal on-the-job training, and thus they were easily replaced. All of this was happening at the same time that farms were getting machines that could do a lot of the labor for them, so farm hand jobs were suddenly disappearing too. You had lots of people who were no longer needed in the industry they had worked in before, flooding into industries in which they were expendable, and thus paid very little, in living conditions that were much more disease-prone and filthy than they'd lived in before, with much more expensive living costs than they'd dealt with before, being worked at times literally to death in miserable work conditions. These types of conditions led to the rise of labor riots and labor unions, seeking compensation for and at times protection from the dangers of working next to poorly managed boilers and open machinery, better accommodations that wouldn't leave one sick and dying from smoke inhalation, and a limit to the amount of hours you could be made to work in a week. The rise of unions makes sense in this perspective. If labor is a commodity, it is natural that those selling it might all decide to increase the price of its sale just to survive, whether that price is actually monetary wages or just safer, cleaner work environments. However, it was in the 1860s that things really ramped up. Labor unions began to become more than short-term coalitions of workers fighting for specific issues at their own jobs, but started to become cross-company organizations with the intent to persist indefinitely. They began to collect dues, lobbying politicians, legally forcing membership to participate in their field of work, and even forming their own political parties, mostly in Europe. They became organizations in their own rights, sometimes as large and wielding as much political and monetary power as the companies they existed to fight. By the 1880s, labor unions were demanding a day to celebrate their victories, and two generic dates were found to be the most popular. There was May 1st because the union known as the American Federation of Labor had passed a resolution calling for the adoption of the 8-hour workday to start as of May 1st, 1886. Or alternatively, there was sometime in September because the weather was nice and good for picnics, so that's a good time to have a day off. I'm dead serious, I'm not making that up. Labor Day is in September because it's good picnic weather, not because it marks any special occasion. President Cleveland chose September over May 1st because the beginning of May also happened to be the anniversary of the Haymarket Riot, which was what news nowadays would call a, quote, peaceful labor protest, end quote, that involved a homemade dynamite-stuffed metal shrapnel bomb which killed a police officer and injured 6 others, and a shootout that left 7 police officers dead, 4 workers dead, and 60 police officers injured. I didn't find any numbers on exactly how many injured workers there were because the newspapers were in the pockets of the corporations, and the unions were exaggerating reports for their cause. But other numbers seem to be corroborated through the coroner report and the police reports. But one thing that isn't disputed by anyone is that the whole thing was over 5 minutes after the bomb started it. In the late 1800s, as labor unions became super popular, they crept into the public sector as well, and that's, well, you see, labor unions at their core are a group of workers banding together to have additional power when negotiating with their employer. And that can be good because it allows negotiation to happen between two groups when it otherwise might not. However, public sector jobs are jobs run by the government and voted on by the voter. While public sector jobs do have some government bureaucracy over them in some form or another, they're government run and thus are paid for and ultimately overseen by the public and public satisfaction. Public sector unions, therefore, are government workers banding together to have additional negotiation power against their employer, which is the public. And there's already a way to deal with issues like that for government jobs. You bring it up to the people for a vote in your local elections. If working conditions for city bus drivers are intolerable, make it an issue, raise public awareness, and get a solution on the ballot. If teachers aren't being paid enough, bring up the issue with those who are paying the taxes that ultimately fill the teachers' paychecks. But instead of promoting local politics to get the people who pay their paychecks involved, they circumvent the people's voice in the name of the people's voice to get change done via the bureaucracy. A public sector union is basically a union to circumvent public voice about public jobs. It seems wrong to me that public sector unions are ultimately paid for with tax dollars, and then they turn around and use those tax dollars to fund federal politicians and political parties that, in exchange, are often putting bureaucrats in charge of the jobs that can be reasoned with by the union so that the union can get more tax money to fund more politicians, etc., etc. Seems like there's a lot of room for corruption there. Cool, so a short summary to help us get back on track. Labor Day is the day we celebrate labor unions getting a day off to celebrate themselves. Great, we're back on track. But Puffin, even though it was signed into law by President Cleveland in the 1800s, only federal workers were given the day off. You are correct. That's another reason why it backfired on him. As late as the 1930s, labor unions were still encouraging workers to strike to make sure they got the day off. Nothing quite like not showing up to work to protest not getting to not show up to work, so that's Labor Day in a coconut shell. Puffin, that's not the way that phrase goes. It was a joke. It was because it was much more exhaustive and detailed than anyone wanted, so it wasn't in a nutshell. It was. Anyway, it's interesting to me that all of this happened around the lifetime of Karl Marx. Marx lived from 1818 to 1883, and during his early life witnessed the beginning of labor unions. This likely affected his philosophy quite a bit. In 1848, he and Engels released the pamphlet known as the Communist Manifesto, which prophesied that workers would slowly all be replaced by machines, which would lead to massive unemployment and deprivation in a time when there was a surplus of goods, which, with better communication devices than the telegraph, would lead to international insurgency of the working class against the oppressive rich who were hoarding all the goods to themselves, which would pan out to leave between 10 to 20% of people running machines in the government, while everyone else lived in the luxury utopia provided by machines. That prophecy didn't happen, and many Marxists today are still actively awaiting, with protests and riots, the proletariat insurgency, despite the massive improvements in living and working conditions since then, and the invention of the middle class. But back then, the ideas Marx put out seemed to catalyze some labor movements into aggressive action. Note that it was about 12 years after the Communist Manifesto was published that things really got going and unions started to become permanent political actors. Now, don't get me wrong here, violence was done by companies to put down labor movements as well. There were spies and thugs hired by companies to literally hunt down, weed out, fire, and beat up company dissenters. It was a crazy and bad time. But I don't think it was the violent labor riots that ultimately changed the conditions of the workers for the better, despite what the unions say. Yeah, there were some victories for sure. Some that persist to this day, such as getting paid overtime if you work more than 40 hours in a week, unless you're salaried, paid commission, or a contract worker, so basically only if you're paid hourly. But the major victories of working conditions and working wages, I don't believe were particularly affected by the violent riots. Consider this. In January of 2020, Taco Bell announced that it would be paying people six-figure salaries plus benefits to manage their fast food stores. And they used that to almost literally beg people to manage their stores. To those who can't count, a six-figure salary is $100,000 a year to run a fast food shop. There was a labor shortage because companies saw a fertile economy for growth and were growing faster than there were people to fill the jobs made. This caused a decent increase in competition to get employees even among the lower-skilled jobs. Many fast food restaurants in my own town were advertising that they would help pay for your schooling or offered competitive wages to get people to work there. After being told for years that greedy companies had to be forced to pay minimum wage and that minimum wage had to be drastically increased by fiat or no one would be paid fair wages, hundreds of classical economists were finally vindicated as the minimum wage almost ceased to be needed because of market competition for labor. Now, I'm no historian, though I do study history, and I'm no economist, though I do study economics, but I can't help but think that much of what led to the improved conditions that ended the labor riots wasn't the violence of the riots, but just the natural progress of the economy. I can't imagine that J.P. Morgan would improve working conditions just because someone threw a bomb at a police officer in Chicago. What would he care? But as the world improved, and economies began to boom, and commodities dropped in price from the surplus being produced by the Industrial Revolution, and the costs to build new factories dropped because factories were building parts to make factories, and food prices dropped because of the reduced labor necessary to grow and process it, and the increased size and density of housing due to decreasing steel prices and increasing steel production. There was, over time, incentive to not treat workers like cattle, because there were other places to work, other places to live, and the cost of living had dropped enough to make it take less work to live more comfortably. But, Poffin, how can you say the labor riots didn't bring that about when the riots happened, and then the conditions improved? I mean, that's just obvious. It's kind of like complaining about how you have to go to school every day until eventually you graduate and don't have to go anymore. There isn't a causation between the action you were taking of complaining and the resultant end of school. But hey, you complained and then you didn't have to go anymore. Correlation, am I right? Another example of this type of improvement over time is weekends. The weekend wasn't invented to appease any labor union's desires to keep work under 40 hours a week, but rather because Henry Ford got tired of some of his Christian employees always taking Sundays off and some of his Jewish employees always taking Saturday off, and how that was messing with scheduling in his factory. And unfortunately, often it was causing worker shortages that led to too few people for the factory to run efficiently, but still there were a lot of people that had to be paid. And since his factories were so productive on the other days of the week, it wasn't worth the hassle to keep trying to schedule around sudden worker shortages every other weekend. So he just started giving everyone those 2 days off, rather than trying to find temp employees who were willing to just work Saturdays and Sundays to fill the holes. Note that Ford was a raging anti-Semite, but that didn't matter as much as the stability of his factories. So, weekends are 2 days, not just one. I started this off by calling Labor Day the lamest federal holiday. I should probably clarify that. Labor Day is a day that we take off from work to celebrate labor unions, which in that time seemed often inspired by Marx, getting time off for workers. I'm not saying it's lame to get a day off in September. It's a nice weekend between July 4th and Thanksgiving. But the message that the unions were motivated by is literally the opposite message of the next federal holiday, Thanksgiving. In case you went to public schools like me and thus weren't taught the actual story of the first Thanksgiving, let's do a super quick crash course for you. I'll probably do a more in-depth dive of this story in November, but until then, let's crash course. When the Pilgrims left the Mayflower at Plymouth Rock, they had a charter that said that they would share everything. The land they'd been given would be communally owned and farmed. The food grown on it would be communally owned and shared. They would communally build houses for the whole group. It would be great. That first winter, half of them starved to death and died of disease and exposure. William Bradford said, "Holy crap, we gotta change the way we're doing things," and thought, maybe people are expecting others to pick up the slack, so they're not working as hard for their own survival. I mean, how do you even know how hard you have to work for it to be your fair share on the communal farm? The next year, he divided the land equally between each of the surviving families and said, "You eat what you grow, so start farming." Yes, the Indians taught them to bury fish in order to grow corn. That's not the reason they didn't starve in winter. They weren't only eating corn all year long. It's because William Bradford figured out a simple piece of human nature and motivation that has gone over the heads of Marxists ever since. Thanksgiving is literally a day we celebrate the discovery that communism didn't work over 200 years before it had a name. Labor Day is the day that organizations inspired by the man who coined the name communism violently demand that we do what they tell us, and we celebrate them for it. I find it poetic that these two holidays land so closely together, and I find it doubly poetic that one of these holidays gets most people 2 days off instead of just one. So today, as you stand beside your barbecue grill for the last time this summer, remember that this day you have enjoyed off from your work is thanks to the violent riots of the labor movement, who just wanted a day off to celebrate the better working conditions that they'll take credit for, but that probably just arose naturally, because capitalism makes everything better eventually. And with the direction of today's economy, that's a little ray of sunshine that we could all use. Thanks for watching. Be sure to like if you didn't hate it, subscribe if you don't hate me, and share this with people you know, because I'm not good enough for YouTube to share things for me. Also, leave a comment, because that's how YouTube knows that this video was good enough for them to share it with other people. Also, I have a Patreon if you want to be a patron of my content. I don't expect you to support me, but if you wanted to, at the middle tier you can get yourself a mug with butt puffin on it, and it would really help me get some of the production equipment I lack. Take care, and I'll see you next time.